If you are enjoying these forgotten cases, please like the video and subscribe. It really helps this channel grow. And tell me in the comments, where are you listening from? What is the weather like there right now? There is a particular hush that settles over a respectable suburban street on a Sunday evening when the church bells have finished ringing and the gas lamps have not yet been lit, and it is into exactly that hush. On a quiet road in Richmond, southwest London, in the spring of 1879, that our story tonight descends. Tonight we examine the murder of Julia Martha Thomas, a case the Victorian press came to call the Barnes mystery, and which would not be fully solved, not completely, not beyond every shadow of doubt for 131 years. Before this story ends, you will hear of a body disposed of in a laundry copper meant for boiling washing. You will hear of a missing foot found on a rubbish heap in a neighbouring town. You will hear of a woman who, for 2 full weeks, lived inside her murdered employer's house, wore her murdered employer's clothes, and answered to her murdered employer's name. You will hear of a jury made up entirely of women, summoned for a single, strange purpose. And you will hear how, more than a century later, a world-famous naturalist's garden gave up the one piece of evidence that had eluded investigators since the case began. Tonight's examination draws from Old Bailey trial records, contemporary newspaper archives, inquest testimony, and the historical accounts compiled in the years following the case. Picture Richmond in 1879, not yet swallowed into the sprawl of Greater London, but a genteel, semi-rural district along the curve of the Thames, where grey stone villas stood with modest front gardens, and the river moved slowly past under the arches of its railway bridges. It was a place of churchgoers and tradesmen, of horse-drawn carts on the high road, of coal smoke rising from chimneys on a Sunday morning, while the bells of the local chapels called the faithful to worship. The air, according to surviving accounts of the district, carried the mingled scents of damp riverbank and the smoke of nearby public houses establishments that, in a town otherwise known for its respectability, did a steady trade. Laundry coppers simmered on Monday mornings in nearly every kitchen on the street, the smell of boiling water and lye drifting out over garden walls, as ordinary and unremarkable as the ringing of the half-hour bell. This was a society organized, with almost mathematical precision, around the figure of the domestic servant. By the standards of the era, nearly 4 in every 10 working women in England were employed inside someone else's household, cooking, cleaning, fetching water, emptying chamber pots, living under the same roof as their employers, while remaining, in the eyes of the law and of society, almost entirely without protection. A servant's wages were modest, often only a few pounds a year beyond board and lodging, and the temptation toward petty theft was, by the standards of contemporary observers, an ever-present feature of the relationship between mistress and maid. Reputation, for a woman in service, was the only currency that mattered, and reputation travelled by word of mouth between mistresses, through written character references, and through the small, watchful gossip of neighbours who noticed who came and went, from which house, and when. It was also an era still absorbing the aftershocks of the Great Famine that had driven so many from Ireland to England a generation earlier, migrants who arrived seeking work and were met, in large measure, with suspicion, prejudice, and a persistent association in the English press between Irishness and criminality. There had already been, by this point, repeated episodes of violence between Irish and English labourers in the cities, as well as attacks attributed to Irish nationalist groups on English soil, and the climate of suspicion this produced shaped the way an Irish servant accused of violence against an English mistress would inevitably be received. This larger tension between an empire that needed cheap domestic labour and a society deeply uneasy about who was providing it runs beneath nearly every page of what follows. Park Road in Richmond, where 2 semi-detached villas called Mayfield Cottages stood a short walk from a public house known locally as the Hole in the Wall, was an unremarkable street by every account that survives. It would not remain unremarkable for very long. Julia Martha Thomas was, by the testimony of her own physician, a small, well-dressed woman of about 54 years of age. She had been twice widowed, and since the death of her second husband in 1873, she had lived alone at number 2, Mayfield Cottages, on Park Road. She had trained earlier in life as a schoolteacher, and those who knew her described an excitable, particular temperament, a woman regarded by her neighbours as somewhat eccentric, given to long and unexplained absences from her home, and known to dress with more elegance than her modest, lower-middle-class means strictly allowed. She kept a household servant less out of practical necessity, by most accounts, than out of a desire to maintain the outward appearance of a certain social standing, a standing that, in truth, was more fragile than her wardrobe suggested. Thomas was, by her own household's testimony, a difficult woman to work for. She had struggled for years to keep a servant in her employ for any meaningful length of time, and was known among the small community of domestic workers in Richmond as a demanding and exacting mistress. She was also, in her own quiet way, devout a regular attendant at the local Presbyterian church, a woman who organised her Sundays around the rhythm of evening service. Into this small, particular household, on the 29th of January, 1879, came a woman calling herself Kate Webster, though she had been born some 30 years earlier, as Kate Lawler, in the townland of Killearn, County Wexford, Ireland. Details of her early life are difficult to verify with confidence, since many of her own later statements about herself proved unreliable, but she claimed at various times to have been married to a sea captain and to have borne him 4 children, all of whom, by her account, died along with their father within a short span of one another. What can be more firmly documented is a long criminal record, a larceny sentence served in Wexford while she was scarcely 15 years old, a further 4 years of penal servitude for theft committed after she arrived in England, and a succession of additional convictions across West London under at least 4 different aliases, Webb, Gibbs, Gibbons, and Lawler among them. She had given birth to a son in 1874, naming 3 different men as his possible father over the years, and during her repeated stretches in prison, the boy had been cared for by a friend, a fellow charwoman named Sarah Creese. None of this history was known to Julia Thomas, who hired Webster on the spot, apparently without making any inquiry whatsoever into her new servant's background or character, an omission that, in the small, gossip-bound world of Victorian domestic service, was unusual enough to be remarked upon afterward. Webster had, in fact, come to Thomas's attention only by chance, having briefly filled in for the ailing Sarah Creese at the home of a mutual acquaintance, who then recommended her to Thomas on the strength of that brief, temporary engagement. The two women's worlds intersected through nothing more dramatic than an employment advertisement and a chance recommendation, the ordinary, unremarkable mechanism by which countless Victorian households filled their service staff, and by which, on this particular occasion, a household came to harbour a woman capable of an act its mistress could not possibly have imagined. The relationship between mistress and servant deteriorated with unusual speed. Thomas criticised Webster's cleaning, going over her work afterward, and pointing out, in Webster's own later words, places she claimed had not been properly done, what Webster described as evidence of a nasty spirit directed toward her. By the final week of February, Thomas had grown so uneasy in Webster's company that she had begun asking friends to stay with her, rather than be alone in the house. On the 28th of February, she gave Webster notice. Webster asked to remain 3 additional days. Thomas, hesitantly, agreed. Sunday, the 2nd of March, 1879, was Webster's half-day. She was expected home in time to help Thomas dress for evening service. She did not return promptly. Witnesses at the church later recalled Thomas arriving visibly agitated, telling a fellow congregant she had been delayed by her servant's failure to come home on time, and that Webster had flown into a terrible passion when reproached for it. Thomas returned home from church early, at around 9 in the evening, and confronted Webster directly. What followed, according to the confession Webster would eventually give, was an argument that became a quarrel, and a quarrel that ended with Thomas thrown from the top of the staircase to the ground floor below. Webster, by her own account, then strangled her employer to prevent her from screaming. The neighbouring household heard a single thump, like a chair falling over. They thought nothing of it. What followed has entered the historical record in unusually precise, almost clinical detail, owing largely to Webster's own eventual confession. The body dismembered with a razor, a meat saw, and a carving knife, the flesh boiled in the household's laundry, copper, the very vessel ordinarily used to wash linen, the bones burned, where possible, in the kitchen hearth. The neighbours noticed an unfamiliar, unpleasant smell drifting from the house, though it raised no immediate alarm, since Monday, wash day activity was an unremarkable, expected sound and smell in any household of the period. The strange detail that would outlast every other element of this case is this. When Webster came to pack the remains into a travelling bag and a corded wooden box, she found that the head and one foot simply would not fit. She buried the head beneath the stables of the hole-in-the-wall public house, a few hundred yards from the house where she had killed her employer. The foot she discarded separately, on a rubbish heap in nearby Twickenham. Neither would be found for generations. If you're finding this case as compelling as we are, please take a moment to like this video and subscribe to our channel. It truly helps us continue researching and sharing these forgotten stories from history. We also read every comment, so let us know your thoughts on this case below. Now, let's continue. In the days following the murder, Webster maintained an unsettling performance of ordinary domestic routine, receiving tradesmen, accepting orders, continuing the household's affairs as though nothing whatsoever had changed. On the 4th of March, she travelled to her old neighbourhood of Hammersmith to visit a family she had not seen in 6 years, wearing Thomas's silk dress and carrying a travelling bag packed with some of the remains. She introduced herself to them as Mrs. Thomas, explaining that she had married, borne a child, been widowed, and inherited a house in Richmond from an aunt. She disposed of the bag, almost certainly into the river, while her old acquaintances drank inside a public house. She then persuaded the family's son to help her carry a heavy wooden box to the railway station and, crossing Richmond Bridge, dropped it into the Thames instead, without raising the boy's suspicion at all. The first lead investigators pursued went nowhere. When the box was recovered the following morning by a coal porter named Henry Wheatley, washed up near Barnes Railway Bridge, the examining doctor erroneously concluded the remains belonged to a young, dark-haired woman, a misidentification that sent the inquest toward an open verdict and very nearly buried the case along with its victim. An inquest held over 2 days in mid-March returned no determination as to the cause of death, and the unidentified remains were laid to rest in Barnes Cemetery on the 19th of that month, under a name that was not her own, in a grave that for the time being nobody could connect to anyone at all. The second dead end was geographic, with no name, no missing person report yet filed, and no means of identification. There was simply nothing connecting an unclaimed torso in the Thames to a quiet widow in Richmond whom nobody, as yet, had thought to report missing. Investigators of this period worked without fingerprinting, without blood typing, without any forensic technique capable of matching tissue to a named individual. Their evidence was almost entirely circumstantial, built from testimony, timing, and physical traces left behind at a scene. What they did have was the accumulating ordinary-seeming detail: a servant recently dismissed, a house gone quiet for 2 weeks, a removal van arriving to collect furniture nobody had seen the owner authorize, and a woman calling herself Mrs. Thomas, who was, in fact, nothing of the kind. Then came the revelation. When the furniture removal men arrived at Mayfield Cottages on the 18th of March, the neighbours asked who had ordered the goods taken away. The answer was Mrs. Thomas, and they pointed directly at Kate Webster. Newspapers across Britain and Ireland seized on the unfolding case with extraordinary appetite, dubbing it the Barnes mystery before Thomas was even identified. and several historians have since noted that early press speculation, including theories that the remains had been used for anatomical dissection, ran well ahead of anything investigators had actually established. Webster was arrested at her uncle's farm near Enniscorthy, County Wexford, on the 29th of March, identified by a head constable who recalled having arrested her there 14 years earlier for an unrelated theft. She was returned to England, and her case generated public interest on a scale that, by surviving accounts, bordered on spectacle. Crowds gathered at railway stations along her route to jeer and gawk, and the pre-trial hearings at Richmond drew, in the words of one contemporary newspaper, an immense crowd and very great excitement. The trial opened at the Old Bailey on the 2nd of July, 1879, before Mr. Justice Denman. The prosecution was led personally by the Solicitor General, Sir Hardinge Giffard itself, a measure of how seriously the case was regarded. Webster's defence, conducted by the barrister Warner Slay, rested almost entirely on the circumstantial nature of the evidence against her, and on her devotion to her young son as a character argument against her capacity for such violence. She had also attempted, before trial, to implicate two innocent men, her former acquaintance Henry Porter and a furniture buyer named John Church, both of whom were cleared after producing solid alibis, a manoeuvre that did considerable damage to whatever sympathy might otherwise have been extended to her. The single most damaging piece of testimony came from a bonnet maker named Maria Durden, who told the court that Webster had visited her a week before the murder. Speaking of property and jewellery, she intended to sell in Birmingham property that, at the time, still belonged entirely to a living Julia Thomas. The jury read this as evidence of premeditation. After 6 days of testimony, the jury required only about an hour and a quarter to convict her. As sentence was about to be passed, Webster claimed she was pregnant in an apparent attempt to delay or avoid execution. The presiding judge admitted he had never, in over 30 years on the bench, encountered such a situation, and the court resorted to an archaic legal mechanism rarely invoked even in that era. A jury of 12 matrons, drawn from women attending the courtroom that day, accompanied by a surgeon who examined her in a private room for only a few minutes before concluding she was not, in the legal language of the time, quick with child, a finding that left unresolved, even at the time, the separate medical question of whether she might still have been pregnant by an earlier and more modern definition. An appeal lodged with the Home Secretary in the days before her execution was formally refused, on the grounds that no sufficient cause had been found to interfere with the course of the law. The sentence of death stood. What remains genuinely unresolved, even now, is the precise sequence of violence in those final minutes at the top of the staircase, whether the fall alone might have proven fatal, or whether strangulation was the deciding act, a distinction Webster's own shifting confessions never fully settled, even at the very end. Kate Webster was hanged at Wandsworth Prison at 9 o'clock on the morning of the 29th of July, 1879, by the hangman William Marwood, using the long drop technique he had recently developed to bring about a swifter death. The night before her execution, she finally confessed in full, taking sole responsibility for the killing and formally clearing the 3 men she had earlier tried to implicate. She was buried in an unmarked grave within the prison's exercise yard. A crowd waiting outside the walls cheered when the black flag was raised, signalling that the sentence had been carried out. The case left a lasting and uncomfortable mark on Victorian society's understanding of itself. Commentators of the period seized upon nearly every aspect of Webster that diverged from the era's expectations of femininity: her physical strength, her composure in court, her sexual history, her Irish origins, treating each as further confirmation of an innately criminal nature, in a way that historians studying the case since have identified as deeply entangled with the period's prejudice against Irish immigrants. The murder also unsettled something more specific. An entire social order had been built on the assumption that a servant's deference was permanent and reliable. And Webster's violence, compounded by her brazen two-week impersonation of the very woman she had killed, suggested, however briefly, that the boundary between mistress and maid was a good deal thinner than anyone wished to believe. Return, in the end, to Julia Martha Thomas, a woman who had survived widowhood twice, who taught before she kept house, who dressed carefully and attended chapel faithfully, and whose last recorded words, written in her own hand on the final page of her diary, were simply, "Gave Catherine warning to leave." She was, for 131 years, buried twice over, first in an unmarked grave at Barnes Cemetery beneath remains that could not even be confidently identified as hers, and a second time beneath the ordinary, unremarkable foundations of a public house stable yard, where her skull lay undisturbed through 2 world wars and the entire span of the 20th century. It was workmen renovating a property for the naturalist Sir David Attenborough in October of 2010 who finally found it. Carbon dating, fracture patterns consistent with a fall down a staircase, and collagen levels consistent with prolonged boiling brought the coroner, in July of 2011, to record what the original 1879 inquest never could: a verdict of unlawful killing, the cause of death recorded at last as asphyxiation and head injury. What survives today are the Old Bailey trial transcripts, a scattering of penny broadsheets printed within days of the execution, and the quiet brick houses on Park Road, still standing, indistinguishable from any other street in Richmond. A skull waited in the ground for 131 years. The rest of her is still down there, somewhere, unmarked,